Good, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the last lecture, Has the Parish a Future? And on my slide, I have a very, I think, rather beautiful chapel, very modernistic looking chapel from South Africa, which is supposed to show people resting under the wings of the Almighty. So you won't be surprised to know that I think the parish has a future. And in this last talk, I'll be looking at the possible ways it might survive and indeed flourish in the later 21st century. But the answer is multifaceted, and it depends on national and diocesan initiatives, as well as parish level responses. First of all, the church has to acknowledge the value of the parish if it is to survive. So nationally, we need some way of addressing the burden of repairs on historic churches and have a public conversation about the way forward. It's a miracle that our parish churches today as a whole are in good repair, given the central role of local people in maintaining them. Yet the dedicated religious building stream of national lottery funding has been removed, which is really unfair, given, for example, that churches, that's just Anglican churches, make up 45% of all Grade 1 listed buildings in the country. So the place of worship stream should be restored and extended. There should also be national resources and information on which parishes could draw for grant application, which is professional work. Cathedrals employ heritage experts to guide them through the processes, and such expertise should in some way be available to local churches. And so I'm delighted that the Centre for Christianity and Culture at the University of York is planning, it's not out yet, so I can't illustrate it, but they are planning an online resource to guide parishes through the labyrinths of grant application. So look at their website, because it will soon, I hope, be up. A second aim of a national conversation should look at the possibility of a church commissioner's endowment matched by the government to be drawn on in cases of a special need or largeness of scale. As we know, the commissioners made a grant of 100 million to fund and address the historic damage of slavery. One might see my proposed endowment as a way of acknowledging the tithed working classes' contribution to making and supporting these buildings in the past. But in fact, the church commissioners' money was given for the purposes of maintaining church buildings and stipends. So it would be very worthy and appropriate work. A secular state like France is responsible for the upkeep of cathedrals nationally and 90% of parish churches through the commune. Although there's a severe cost of living crisis, and therefore the time seems unpropitious for any government outlay, the importance of parish churches as part of the social and community service is all the more important. As I mentioned in the last lecture, the National Churches Trust, using government figures, puts the value of church social service as 55 billion per year. And without that parish network of support, more government money would be expended. Self-interest should motivate government action, if nothing else. And Save the Parish has been calling for a kind of commission into parish churches. Also, while maintaining their resources for the future, the church commissioners could be asked to redirect some of the money they give in strategic development fund funding towards parishes for stipends and to theological education that will give us the well-trained, confident clergy we need. And as I pointed out, the Choate report has shown that, it's not getting what they hoped for through the resource church network. Fifthly, church closures and sales should be reduced. I argued in an earlier talk there was a distinct class bias in evangelism, with pioneer ministry for the social housing estates and resource churches for the middle classes. And only this week, there's a report, The Church on the Margins, has been published about the distribution of church closures in Greater Manchester, which reveals that the majority of closures are in deprived areas. Between 2010 and 20, the Church of England closed 13 churches in the two lowest quintiles of deprivation, and only 7 in the top 2, twice as many, with just 1 from the middle. So that's what they could do nationally. Diocesan. Here's an incredibly expensive church house they bought, costing millions when they put the diocese together to make a big diocese of Leeds. So this rather indicates what I'm going to say, which is that to make parishes flourish, we need simpler and cheaper diocesan administration structures, with centralising of some functions to lift the burden locally and gain economy of scale. The rise of dioceses of administrative entities has already been outlined, as well as their exponential growth, with the worst examples having almost as many central diocesan employees as stipendiary clergy. 45% is one figure. Truro, for example, has 38 admin staff and only 64 stipendiary clergy, and they're hoping to cut those. Part of the reason for the size of these diocesan bodies, apart from an embrace of managerialism, which leads to centralisation, is first the rage for communication and its policing. Oxford Diocese, for example, employs 5 communication officers, which is more than my own university does, and I thought they were obsessed with this kind of thing. Secondly, part of it is the need to show compliance with safeguarding, health and safety, etc. And thirdly, the reorganisation agenda itself. Safeguarding, given the woeful failures of the past, is crucial, but it's not at all clear that the way it's being done, with everyone from the PCC treasurer to the church opener forced to do wave after wave of it, actually does anything to prevent abuse. When one looks at past errors, they are to do with those in authority, especially clergy and bishops. Yet in some dioceses, lay volunteers are made to do 3 training events every 3 years, and new ones for each role they have. All this seems to be more to do with protection of the institution from accusations than ensuring the safety of children or vulnerable adults. So dominates, we have Safeguarding Sunday and a kind of pathologizing of our relationships. I would argue we need a more positive account of human flourishing to undergird the care of the vulnerable and avoid the oppression of the bully and the abuser. What I would call a parochial anthropology of interconnectedness and mutual care. If safeguarding could be integrated into other learning, it would be more effective and less intimidating, especially to ordinary lay people, and it would need fewer paid safeguarding trainers. My third point, that pastoral reorganisation and mission initiatives cause a bloated diocesan structure, has already been demonstrated, and I gave the example of Sheffield in an earlier talk, with its extra archdeacons, associate archdeacons, Lights for Christ enablers, and so on. It's costly and complicated to change parish structures and uses energies that could be more productively employed. Dioceses are also not making full use of the resources they do have, especially the glebe land taken from the parishes. Save the Parish has demonstrated that 58% of dioceses are failing to generate a reasonable income from this fund, which was where they put all our money. 23% are failing to make reasonable investment gains, and Oxford even tried illegally to use the money for another purpose, not for stipends at all. My figures are from the Save the Parish Finscrut research arm, They are ready to sit down with the diocese and work out a better investment strategy. We aim to challenge the view that you often get presented with, that there is no alternative. And then, thirdly, we want dioceses to stop centralizations and pastoral reorganizations. Paul Avis, the very eminent ecclesiologist, notes, proposals to merge parishes, combine PCCs, close church buildings are usually profoundly misguided. Centralized paternalism is a stock recipe for decline. It's a spiral. It's behaving like footlocker. The more you have less, the more you have centrally and the less you have on the front line. You just close branches, thus making you have even less money coming through parish share. And so it just gets worse and worse. However, some dioceses are taking a different path, and this is what I hope will happen in the future. St Edmundsbury and Ipswich, for example. Tiffer Robinson describes the change that came about when the new bishop, Martin Seeley, arrived 6 years ago. He announced soon after he arrived, the policy of cutting clergy posts to meet our shortfall in parish share was a plan for decline and not for flourishing. Instead, for the past 5 years, our diocese has sought to counter a chronic annual deficit of around £500,000 through increased giving and encouraging growth. It seems to have succeeded because, he says, it was accompanied by support for parishes, not chastisement for those unable to pay their full share, a genuinely pastoral senior ministry, and real valuing of clergy and local ministry. Everybody felt they were in it together and that they could see a clear strategy that was about making the parish flourish. My picture, though, is of Bishop Julie of Chelmsford, who has said to her diocesan synod, there will be no more initiatives imposed from the so-called centre, but instead a focus on local discernment and discovery. A single strategy will no longer be the glue. Everything we do must flow out of what we believe, rather from a set of instructions we're told to follow. So she's taking a different path and not going with the central way of doing things. I mentioned Blackburn Diocese last week, which is far from having the kind of financial reserves some ancient dioceses enjoy. In September 2021, its bishop stated, as a diocese, we remain committed to parish life, to maintaining our current numbers of stipendiary clergy, to forming excellent priests and lay leaders, and investing in the front line. And Bishop Philip North, that's Bishop Julian there, but Bishop Philip North continued to point out that parishes pay for the ministry they receive. So cutting priests means cutting the money the parishes give you, and is a recipe for decline. He says, and when the messages you're giving out are, oh, we're in trouble, decline is inevitable, we have to embrace the future becomes the thing of threat. Morale goes down and parishes stultify. And the picture you've got here is a wonderful project that Bishop Julian has started, which is challenging grown-ups and children alike to get to know the Bible better. And he has a whole series of challenges they have to go through, and it's been very successful. And it's not about money, but it's about what really kind of matters. I mentioned deepening Bible knowledge before. Here's a good example. What I'm trying to argue here is that some dioceses, even poor ones, are avoiding the worst excesses of pastoral reorganisation, and that we could redistribute money more fairly and effectively. So what can parishes do? What will the parishes of the future be like? Well, we're not going to turn around the individualism and inward turn of contemporary society overnight. But I am hopeful, partly, of a kind of kairos, a kind of moment of crisis opening globally at the moment, in which the neoliberal project is failing. Either you're finding a new totalitarianism or populism. It's proving harder and harder to ground reality without the divine. This makes the need for a non-nationalistic, non-racist, universal mode of humanity all the more pressing. And this, of course, is offered by the Church as the place of reconciliation and witness to the possibility of a common good. And I think there are parallels today with the situation after World War II, which I described in an earlier lecture, when the totalitarian regimes had been destroyed and people looked for a good universal in which we all might share. The sociality of the Church and her call to cooperation spoke to the moment. So part of the success of the 1950s, which, if you remember, church membership and everything else kind of grew for a short time, was that there was a synergy between the common good communitarian politics of the time and the Church's own mission. Well, we have the gift of a similar situation in our time with the climate crisis, which has focused church attention on its core theology of creation, and also made us aware of the narrative of salvation as having an ecological dimension. And I would say that, unlike the case of the embrace of theological liberalism in the 1960s, or that kind of Bonhoefferism and anti-parishness, anti-congregationalness, in which they let the world set the agenda and the Church kind of followed afterwards, the new ecological attention chimes with our own core theology. Anglicanism has often been characterized by something called pan-sacramentality. You get it in William Temple, but you also get it in the pastor naturalists of the past and a number of theological voices. And that's the idea that the whole of reality, the whole physical world, is in some sense sacramental and mediates the divine. It's been a big Anglican focus over the centuries. And our pastor naturalists, I mentioned, saw the parish as including all the forms of life within their care. And as I pointed out last week, this realization is increasingly energizing parishes up and down the country. And it's not an imposition from without, even though the targets might sometimes be. Whether there's a climate crisis or not, a theology of creation is central to Christian faith and its apologetic task. It's not just a question of presenting the good news of Christ today, but of beginning further back and offering a proposal of the world as having a divine origin and being regarded as a made thing, a divine gift. So before you can convince people that Christ is God, you've got to convince them that the world has a creator, that there is such a thing as God. And I'm arguing that creation is the way to do it. Nowadays, ecological thinking has become the implicit faith of the wider community, especially our secular education system. If you've got children or grandchildren, you will know this. And I would argue the future parish will find a natural role as a kind of gathering place where we can make common cause to save our planet. So Baroness Sherlock describes the Eco-Fest in her parish in County Durham. It's in a parliamentary debate about the parish. The result is a huge mix of campaign groups, green campaigners, alternative energy providers, people who do vegetable boxes, beekeepers, fair trade stores, bicycle repair workshops, and a car sharing club. A toy swap shop for the kids, the Durham Food Bank will be there because our church members are involved, and the rector will lead us all in beer and hymns, accompanied by a brass band, this being the North East. Well, that debate was in, I think, 2015. But as you can see, they're still doing, this was last summer, they're still doing their Eco Festival in the church grounds. They're gathering all these other groups and giving them a place to meet. And note how such an event allows worship and the proclamation of the gospel through hymn singing, nurturing of community, loving service, righting injustice, caring for creation. All those 5 marks of mission. The local church collaborates with other bodies involved in cognate activities, but through that gathering role that Oliver O'Donovan articulated as its key contribution. And it joins with other groups and doesn't try to do everything for itself, or even in one sense lead. It's called the Neville's Cross Festival. Grounded, though. It's nice because that has that biblical sense of grounded in love. Indeed, as the Common Good Foundation reminded us last time, poverty or vulnerability of the parish can become the occasion for new local relationships, as was the case for the church pictured here, St. John the Baptist on the Ermine estate at Lincoln. They couldn't afford to cut that enormous bit of grass around the church, so they worked with the Lincoln Conservation Group to manage the site, and they actually scythe it. They do it like a kind of wildflower meadow, and then they come along and scythe it. This reliance on another body is a salutary example of how a future local church will have to learn to be humbler and ask for help, seeing its vulnerability as an opening to new relationships and mutual support. St. Paul gives us the example in 1 Corinthians 2. I came to you in weakness and in fear and with much trembling. Paul Avis argued that the relation between society and church is actually reciprocal. Their destinies are linked together. The Christian community and the wider community are in the same boat. Today, many national institutions are fragile and threatened, just as the church is. So we all need to stick together with people who want to serve the common good. So parish is an invitation to find ourselves in terms of interdependence. Its local scale, which Michael Northcott defines as that of face-to-face communication, exchange, and relations between persons and species, allows us to orient ourselves. It's where we start from. Without that set of coordinates, we can't move or understand who we are or where we are, city, suburb, or rural area. It's the opposite, though, of centralizing organization of space, which I've illustrated here on my slide, by the panopticon designed by the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, in which one single guard, there he is in the middle, could keep a whole building under surveillance. And it's become a potent image for a controlling gaze, which objectifies, in contrast to which I would argue was a bit like the current centralizing moves in some dioceses, which would condemn clergy to a life of constant commuting. In contrast to that, I would argue that the parish priest of the future will not be a controller, rushing about unseen, but humbler, going about by cycle or on foot or on the bus whenever practicable. I know one priest in London who's got one of those little electric scooters, which gives her speed and an ability to be flagged down for conversation. Because another feature of the local parish of the future will be that locality of scale, enabling a local ministry on the streets. Father Darren Percival, pictured there, walked through his 2 deprived Leeds parishes, St Hilda's Cross Green and St Saviour's Richmond Hill, during COVID. He told the Yorkshire Post, it was important people knew that though the building was closed, the church was still open. I walked the streets in my cassock as usual, so people could see the church was still there for them. His many parochial activities during lockdown included a food hub, getting children involved in sporting challenges at home, and delivering Easter eggs to any child who put a drawing of one in their window. He did pastoral work sitting on a handy wall, and his funeral ministry increased. Similarly, during lockdown, Michelle Webb walked the streets of her estate parishes, St John's and St Giles, Lincoln, looking for families who'd like a bag of biblical craft materials to replace the holiday club. She found a doorstep ministry as the bags provoked curiosity about faith. This pastoral perambulation led to listening, which enabled the churches to respond to evident food poverty with free tea Friday in the school holidays, where they did kind of biblical crafts, but they, as families, and they had a sort of Bible story and a free tea. Such activities gather community and proclaim the gospel. And I think more and more, this ministry of presence, which is ancient horse sense, also belongs to the future. And this is true because other institutions are seeing the benefit of local presence. Adam Billings is Police and Crime Commissioner for the somewhere in the north, which I've managed to lose the sheet, but it will no doubt, here we are, for South Yorkshire. And in a recent article, he made comparisons between policing and church policy. When the police moved away from police on the beat in favour of mobile teams to save money, they found low-level criminality rising and public trust ebbing away. As the police are unarmed and rely on public consent, this was serious, and the policy was reversed, with neighbourhood teams now restored or established as policy for the future. Billings sees an analogy with a move away from the local parish to mission hubs, with the promotion of variant ecclesiologies, with the parallel alternative system promoted by the Anglican hierarchy. The parish model, he writes, like neighbourhood policing, is also well understood and supported by those who are not churchgoers. The vocabulary we use has meaning for those who don't belong. It's this shared understanding built up over generations that allows the vicar to knock on a door, call in the school or police station without being invited. This operating model with its neighbourhood focus is what the police moved away from and had to recover. From his police experience, he also calls out the impossibility of running two systems. He writes, it's quite disingenuous to say there'll be a mixed economy or mixed ecology. No organisation can operate two operating models simultaneously without distorting its shape. So as far as I'm concerned, the future parish will have to be the model, and outreach will have to have a more integrated relationship to the parish and not be run in competition. But the future parish will still be rooted in its neighbourhood, and the clergy will spend time propping up the bar in local hostelries and visiting cafes. Because the local is the way we are going in politics and economics, including the idea of the 5-minute city, in which work, home, and shops will all be within local reach. In the United States, Bill Katz and Jeremy Novak have written a book about the new localism in urban projects. And contrast to the centralization moves of our diocese, the future is local. The vicar will be more humble and local. A true ecological parochialism will be embedded in community and see it as part of a wider habitat constituted by those relationships which are open to God. So the true mixed ecology is this one, in which the relation is one of mutual support and interdependence, which Church of England documents may refer to, but then betray by instituting segregation and competition. Another role appropriate to the fact we are an established church is that of representation. The late Queen Elizabeth, in a speech at Lambeth, described the role of the established church as one of advocacy of all faith traditions. She said the church has a duty to protect the free practice of all faiths in this country. And this is true at the local level, as well as in relation to the whole parish. I would say that it relates to the plants and the creatures, as well as the people of all the faith traditions. The poet George Herbert describes the representative role of the human in his poem Providence, which I put on the sheet. Man is the world's high priest, he doth present the sacrifice for all, while they below unto the service mutter an assent, such as springs use that fall and winds that blow. So what's going on here is that humankind is mediating and offering praise on behalf of the whole natural order, which is seen to respond through being itself. The springs fall and the winds blow. Its life is its prayer. And the church, the parish church, is the ecclesial outworking of this representative action. So this is how I'd see our representation. But it's pointless for the Church of England to embrace an ecological, sustainable future and at the same time plan out ever larger ecclesial units, which will make clergy and worshippers travel much further to churches across large areas of the mission community. I've been looking at some where you would have to go 30 miles on a Sunday. They're that big. They would discriminate against the poor and the elderly who are dependent on public transport, which is even rarely available in the country on Sundays. In the future parish, it has to be local in scale. Since lockdown, home working has become ever more a reality for many employees, and this tendency is set to increase, leading to numbers of people choosing to move to rural areas to live and work. In the future, for a variety of reasons, we're more likely to live and work locally with less commuting. Already, the high streets in small towns are becoming busier, while great shopping malls are eerily empty. This is therefore the worst time for the Church of England to abandon its rural heartlands, where 40% of its worshippers already live. It doesn't mean we abandon urban outreach, but it should be connected to parishes, just as transport is always connected. If it's to be any good, you need the trains and the buses and the trams, everything to connect. And it shouldn't be in competition. It may be that workplace chaplaincies will return, especially for activities that don't offer home working. So think of Amazon workers in warehouses, people on the railways. This will be a way of reaching the kinds of working class people who have little contact with the church. I've mentioned before the estates work sponsored by the Church of England. 3 examples in Wythenshawe, Rubery, and Twydale reveal parish churches that were all deeply engaged with their local estates. Wythenshawe took the church out to the community by inviting people in various locations around the estate to contribute to a woven artwork of their experience, blessings, and struggles in the area. Rubery, which is sliced by a dual carriageway, commissioned artists to work with people on both sides of the divide in the no-man land under the flyover. The future parish will have to have, as I said last time, an intentional edge to all its activities, otherwise it will not survive. So it will have to have this outward focus that I've mentioned, where you're engaging with the community, but this will have to be balanced by a kind of emphasis and intensity of the relationships between the remnant that survive. Martin Thornton wrote a book years ago in which he argued that the remnant was what mattered in a parish anyway, that the really faithful few. Well, if you're reduced to the faithful few, these are the people who have to have really good relationships one to another if the church is to survive. There has to be what Dan Hardy called an intensity of participation in the new life of Christ, so that there is an urgency and sense of purpose in its core activities. Rootedness in history helps to form part of this intentionality as people understand where they come from and thereby how they might contribute to the ongoing story of the church in that place. So Dan Hardy's stress on the importance of intensity, of living life as a parish with strong relationships of trust, is accompanied with hospitality and an outward focus, with a concomitant sense of extension of its benefit beyond itself. That might happen in very, very small ways if you've got a few old ladies and a dog. It might be more to do with a ministry of prayer, but that can be expressed publicly and communicated. It doesn't matter that you can't put on all these wonderful activities that I've been advocating. You can do it as a liturgical community if in no other way. But to add to ecology and locality, my next mark of the Church of the Future is working with imagination and creativity. In my estate examples of good news, art events and projects were at the heart of outreach. From my academic work on theology and the arts, I know how central the imagination is to an effective proposal of Christian truth and to empowering human beings to see themselves as gifted, made in the image of God the Creator, to share in some way in his creative activity. The charity Art and Christianity accompanies parishes in this work, whether it's commissioning new art, mounting exhibitions in churches, or working with them to make art. The collective Forthland, for example, worked recently with women at St Andrew's Leytonstone and the local Hindu temple to explore ideas of sacred journey and sanctuary, crafting artworks for each place of worship and a soundscape based on the women's memories. There are multiple ways in which churches can offer events, concerts, plays, poetry readings, but also add a poetic edge to liturgy or offer drama instead of a sermon. The visual arts have become much wider in appeal, especially in the form of monumental sculptures. Large audiences are attracted for installations which fire the public imagination, like the one I've shown here. Alfie Bradley's Knife Angel, crafted from weapons handed in response to police amnesties. There are also imaginative acts. A parish in Withington in Lichfield Diocese sent a large lit-up star mounted on a car to different locations in the parish every night during Advent. Local people loved it, and the intense interest was reflected in the increased numbers at the Follow the Star carol service. Was it an artwork? It was certainly a brilliant and imaginative intervention. Future outreach will, I believe, be expressed increasingly through creative modes. And the parish church, which is already an artwork, is an ideal home for this sort of activity. I'm always astonished at how the most unlikely people will produce a passage that speaks to them when invited to bring a reading or an image to speak to. And this kind of communal sharing can be very powerful. Any poet will tell you need a form to allow creativity, and the parish itself is a form of life, what Dan Hardy called a socio-poesis, which should encourage participation and creativity. I was at a lunch this week where everybody, they were all from different villages, and they were all bemoaning how difficult it is to get volunteers to run anything. And that is true. This is true through all organizations. And I think one way in the future is through creativity, because you can get people to come along to creative workshops quite easily. They see it as an experience. You know how you can buy experiences now. But you can then get people kind of involved because they're already participating in something, as making something. And this, I think, will be the key to volunteering in the future. It will be getting people in through creative participation and then working on that to help organize creative participation. You know, do you want to help do flower arranging or whatever? Anyway, that's just my idea. So, to sum up, the parish has been a constantly reshaped form of life over hundreds of years, and its staying power is in that adaptability. In different ways, it's kept the balance between the intensivity of a deep congregational life and an outward-facing generosity towards its whole parish. And in challenging times, this will be the key to its survival. R.S. Thomas began a poem, "I was vicar of large things in a small parish." And this is a vocation to which all parishioners are called, to find the eternal and the universal, large things, within the local and the particular. If the church goes down the road of amalgamating and closing churches, she will find it ever more difficult to attend to small things and the needs of ordinary people. The parish priest, the outsider-insider, must hold the universal within the particular for his or her congregation, who are not, as Thomas admitted, small-minded, but indeed each person opens onto an infinite mystery. David Scott, the gentle poet-priest of Winchester, wrote a celebrated poem about our priestly working garment, or one of them, the surplice, which for me is an image of the parish tradition that we live in, like an old cardigan. He writes, "We have put these garments on for centuries. They persist. We wither and crease inside them. May our parishes persist, for I believe they can, and I believe there is hope for our future, but only if we keep humble, local, and connected."